Hello, everyone. How is everyone this evening?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you for asking. Let's see, any questions about anything?
I have a quick question.
Sure.
So did we decide on a final date for the second paper?
Yes, it was November the 6th.
Okay, thank you
That
very
was
much.
that was the date I had decided. I don't know if anyone else, when you said we, you made it sound like a collective decision. Um, yeah. Okay. Other questions? Okay. So let's see. Where did we leave off last time? Other than you all were pretending never to have heard of Bruce Springsteen. Um,
We were talking about um, the Bostonians going hungry because the people were making bread on the boats.
I think that sounds funny. But, you take, yeah, okay, so that was something that was happening. The Bostonians going hungry. Well, and it wasn't because the French were making bread on their boats. It was because there was generally a grain shortage because the Bostonians were shipping most of, two things. One, they're shipping most of their grain to feed the army. And then B, consequently, if you're someone producing grain, you can actually get a better price by selling it to the army than by selling it here. And so there are allegations of, in fact, in Abigail Adams's one of her letters, she talks about someone who this is actually one of our sources for this, someone who was accused of stockpiling grain, and a group of women went and forced him to break open his warehouse. And not only did they liberate grain, but they also took coffee and sugar and other things that this person, hoping to support his family, was hoarding so that he could sell at a higher price. Some people look at that in a more sinister way. Again, this is a thing historians do, is interpret these kinds of episodes. And did this guy get what was coming to him or not? But I leave that to someone else to work out all of the details of that. Okay, so that's something that is happening. Other things we remember? Jake, you going to venture in?
I'm sorry, what happened? I just got in here. It took like a few minutes to get me in.
Okay, well, I'm glad you're here. No, we were just trying to recollect what we were talking about last time to get back into the frame of thinking about what's happening in the revolution. Since, I tend to go through life thinking that every time I say something, people remember it and it's imprinted on your memories, and that so it forms a seamless narrative there. But I realize that that's not always the case. So, and since I don't always remember from day to day what I have said, so I'm just trying to get to where we should start so that it'll all make sense.
We had talked about the Battle of Monmouth.
Battle of Monmouth, okay. Yeah, last major battle in the North. And that was good. Anything else?
What was it? The attack at Newport, Rhode Island?
No, the Battle of Newport. Okay, this is good. This is good. I think things are coming back, which is good. Anything else anyone remember or think that would be anything you want to know more about? Or do you just want to keep progressing? And once we've covered something, it's pretty much done. You'll never have to hear about the Battle of Monmouth again, unless, of course, you go to New Jersey and or it comes up. I can think of many occasions when the Battle of Monmouth might come up in conversation. By the way, General Charles Lee, whom Washington calls a damned poltroon and other things, demands a court-martial because he wants to air out the differences he has with the commander. He feels, as he rightly, that he's been disrespected by Washington. And so Lee is given a court-martial, and the court-martial actually finds that, well, they don't find that Lee was a damned poltroon, but he's essentially then removed from his post in the army as a result of this. So, and it's a happy thing both for General Lee and for the Continental Army, that Lee is no longer a part of it. So that's one consequence of the Battle of Monmouth. And another is now General Clinton and his forces are holding New York, and Washington and his forces are holding New Jersey. And it's something of now I won't call it a stalemate, because each one knows that the other has the potential to strike. And the real fighting is going to shift to the south. New York remains the British base until 1783, actually until after the war has ended. And Washington really can't leave the area as long as Clinton and his army hold New York, but Clinton and his army recognize they really can't do anything more here. Washington does take the precaution of securing the forts on the a little ways up the Hudson River to protect his communication link with New England. But other than this, the real focus of the war is going to shift to other places. And Clinton believes, rightly so, that people in other parts of the country still want to remain loyal to the crown. Remember, in 1776, he had attempted to take, actually to secure the loyalists in the Carolinas, and had failed at that. And it's something that still really irritated him, that he had this bad time of it in Charleston back in 1776. So Clinton knows that there are people in the Carolinas and in Georgia who would prefer remaining loyal. And also, with the entry of France into the war, the British attention really has shifted to securing the West Indies. And the French fleet that had come too late to help out with the British moving from Philadelphia to New York sees there's not much here. And if the French fleet that then is patched up in Boston sails to the West Indies to protect the France's West Indian holdings. And the British fleet also goes to the West Indies as their focus really is shifted to protecting what they have. And Clinton sends an expedition to secure the Carolinas and Georgia. And in December of 1778, in fact, a British expedition moves up the Savannah River, which is the borderline between South Carolina and Georgia. And there's only token resistance here. The rebels claim that they were in control of Georgia, but most of them flee at the onset of this British fleet. And there are only about 30 guys manning one of their outposts on the Savannah River. I don't know, is anyone familiar with the Savannah River? Has anyone been to that part of the country? No one has. Well, they're, low toward the coast, but then Savannah itself sits on a bluff overlooking the river, which is why it becomes an important post. In fact, it had been a Native American settlement when the British established their colony there in the 1730s. Georgia is the last British mainland colony to be founded. Interesting story I'm not going to get into here. And you'll find that I do say that quite often. This is an interesting story, but I'm not going to tell it to you. Instead, I persist in telling you other things that I haven't said. This is interesting, therefore I'm going to tell it. And the British do take Savannah at the end of 1778, and they capture about 500 men along with about 40 rebel officers. And then Savannah then becomes a base for British operations in the South. And from there, they're going to move on to South Carolina, which we'll get to in a bit. This is going to be the next real focus of British attention. But there are a couple of other things I should tell you about before we get to that. We'll talk a little bit about the West, because that still looms large. And as you probably, I hope you'll recall, the Western country is what precipitated the war between Britain and France in the 1750s, that then triggered Britain trying to manage its empire, and then the expelling the French from North America. So let me just see. I thought I had a few slides here I could show you. If I don't, I apologize. And well, let's see. Nope. Okay. Well, I'll draw a map for you. Okay. So essentially, just for the sake of thinking about this, we have in the central part of the American continent these enormous lakes, the Great Lakes, we call them, and they are inland seas. And from this is roughly where Niagara Falls, where Lake Erie flows into Lake Ontario. And then you come a little ways down here and you have the headwaters of the Ohio River. And here roughly it joins up with the Mississippi River, which then flows down to the Gulf of Mexico. This is the interior west of the mountains. And this is the area that really sparked the war in the 1750s, control of this area and alliances with the native peoples in this area. And the British maintained this, wanted to maintain it as a Native American zone so they could continue the trade, fur trade with the native people into the 1760s and 1770s. And there are a number of forts out here, and just suffice to say that at the time of the outbreak of the war, Fort Pitt here, which is today the city of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, was under the control of American forces. The British held in addition to Canada, which you'll recall the Americans had tried to get a couple of times, the Americans held Detroit. Again, formerly French outpost, critical place because these waterways all traverse through it. By the way, does anyone know what the word Detroit means? It's a French word. Is it anyone here? By the way, I'm not going to go tell Professor Abrams or Professor Salvadon that I do tell them that I've tried to teach French in addition to other things. And is anyone taking French? No one wants to raise their hand now. And by the way, okay, Lisette, do you know what it means?
Straight?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. I thought it was too simple. I was scared that it was wrong.
Well, don't be scared you're wrong. No, that's great. The straight. I was really surprised a few years ago to be in Tangier, which is in Morocco, and to see all these places called Detroit. I wondered why they're naming all these places for Detroit, which anyway, but it's because it means the strait. So the straits that connect Lake Huron and Lake Erie, and then by extension, the entire West. And so port and outpost, the British hold. And from this, in 1770, late 1778, the British General Hamilton, who's the governor of this territory, marches down here. And the Wabash River here flows into the Ohio River, and he retakes the post at Vincennes. Now, meanwhile, remember, this area had been contested by the French, and there still are a lot of French people here living in different settlements along these rivers, trading with the Indians. And here along the Illinois River is the town of Kaskaskia. I'll just write it over here. Vincennes is the place I've been talking about. And so in late 1778, at about the same time, you have Washington taking Monmouth, defeating the British at Monmouth shortly after this, and the British taking Savannah, Georgia. General Hamilton takes Vincennes, and in Kaskaskia, a guy from Virginia, George Rogers Clark, he hears about the British taking Vincennes actually from a French guy in Kaskaskia. And the French don't really like the English coming into this area, since pretty much they've been here on their own for a long time dealing with the Indians, and now suddenly you have the British Army moving in. And this is something that a French informant tells General Clark, who's from Virginia, he's a Virginia militia officer, and so he gets this news toward the end of the year, and so Clark realizes a thing that he could do that the British wouldn't expect would be to attack during the winter. And so in early February of 1779, Clark leads an expedition. He had come down the Ohio River from Fort Pitt and to Kaskaskia, and then he leads an expedition this way back to Vincennes, and there in February of 1779, defeats the British there, captures this much bigger British force. He only has about 200 men with him, and about half of them are French. And they defeat this British force, not expecting at all to be attacked in the middle of winter by this American force. And so this, the British aren't going to send any more reinforcements to hold on to this area. They're anticipating, war being fought in other places. But this Battle of Vincennes in February of 1779 is critical to what's going to happen after the war, or as the war ends, because had Clark not done this, the British, of course, could have argued that the Americans really can't claim anything west of Pittsburgh. And now the Americans have expelled the British from this part of the territory, breaking their link with the Mississippi River, and that's going to be a very important thing in the long run. Now, simultaneously with this, you recall that the Iroquois Confederation, let me see if I have an image of the Iroquois Confederation. Let's see, here we go, good. Okay, so this is a map from 1773 showing the Six Nations of the Iroquois and where they are. You see they're between, here's Lake Erie and flows into Lake Ontario. And they had formed this league before the Europeans had arrived in the New World. And what happens in this is a group of diplomats from the Onondaga Nation here had traveled up to Quebec to consult with the British there. Now, officially, the Iroquois were neutral, but the Onondaga, going to talk with Quebec, convinces Washington that he really needs to do something to protect the American frontier. Should the British, this is in the wake of the defeat of Burgoyne at Saratoga, should the British now start supporting the Iroquois, and because the Iroquois then could attack the frontier of Pennsylvania, which they had done. And Washington is really wary of this happening again. And so what Washington does is sends General John Sullivan, who's really one of the most interesting characters because he's always doing these outrageous things. And he is sent with a force of several thousand men, basically to destroy the Onondagas, to prevent them from having the capacity to wage war. And so Sullivan does march into the Onondaga country and destroy something like 160,000 bushels of corn, destroys villages, cuts down all the fruit trees. It's not simply fighting against a group of Onondaga warriors. It's really trying to undermine the ability of the Onondagas might have to survive. And with the Americans marching here to attack the Onondagas, the Oneidas, another Iroquois group, decide they will side with the Americans. They flee to be under the protection of the Americans. So this has the effect of really devastating the Iroquois, both the Onondaga's capacity to carry on the war, but also it breaks the Iroquois alliance, which is a huge thing to happen here, as the Iroquois alliance is never going to recover from this, well, for a couple of 100 years. So you have this, the war being carried on here on the frontier. Now, let's turn our attention now back to the southern states again, because there you have the British taking Savannah relatively easily and then moving on to the Carolinas. And actually, the war in the Carolinas begins pretty auspiciously for the British. That is in the fall of 1770. Actually, at the end of 1778, the British had taken Savannah, and at the end of 1779, they take Charleston, South Carolina. Actually, the siege begins in April, and in May of 1780, 81 actually. So I'm sorry, I'm really getting ahead of myself here. The siege begins a day or two. Well, General Clinton sails for Charleston the day after Christmas and begins a siege, better prepared than he had been the last time he tried a siege here. And the American army, commanded by General Benjamin Lincoln, is holding Charleston, South Carolina, and it proves to be untenable for Lincoln. And he surrenders his army and the town in May of 1780. And this leaves South Carolina and Georgia under the control of the British. Clinton then goes back to New York because he needs to hold New York in case Washington tries to take it. And so, but now you have the British in control of these two states. Now, Clinton's whole strategy was based on the assumption that most of the white population in Georgia and South Carolina wanted to remain loyal to the British crown. And what happens in the wake of recapturing these two provinces is that Clinton does something reasonable, which is to insist that all of the adult white men take an oath of loyalty that they support the British crown. And this is something of a problem because remember, there'd been a lot of fighting going on here. And what had happened previously is that whites who were captured would be put on parole. That is, you'll agree you're not going to fight anymore. And now you're captured, and so you agree you're not going to fight anymore and you're released. But now that the British are trying to reassert control in the Carolinas, Clinton takes this a step further and he wants them to swear their loyalty to the crown. Well, you might have said, okay, I promise I'm not going to fight anymore, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're now loyal to the crown. You can see this is kind of a dilemma. And another thing that happens is the newly formed government under British auspices doesn't want to have this pretty significant part of the population be pariahs. So they say, okay, bygones are bygones. You fought, you lost, we put you on parole. Now you've sworn your loyalty to the British crown. So we'll just go back to the way things were before. Well, let me ask you this. Suppose you had been loyal to the British crown all along, and your neighbors still had been fighting you all of this time. And now you've won, and the new regime, which you have supported, tells these people who had been fighting against you in the new regime, okay, bygones are bygones, and we're back to being friends again. Some of you may say that's great because we all want to be one big, happy British family. But some of you might hold a grudge. Would anyone here hold a grudge against people who had been calling themselves patriots all these years, which is and saying that you were the enemy because you're supporting the British crown? And who do these people are now saying, hey, we support the British crown now? Yeah, we didn't for about 4 or 5 years. We were fighting against it, but now we're back in the good graces of the British crown just because General Clinton had us take the oath. Who here is forgiving? And who here says, what a bunch of traitors. We should have killed them when we had the chance. By the way, I'm not going to be reporting this to anyone in whichever side you're on. Just raising this. I hope a hypothetical for you, but it's certainly not a hypothetical for these people in South Carolina and Georgia in this period when the British government is trying to reassert peace and stability and order here. and doing it in the least painful way. That is, we're not going to kill all these former rebels. We're simply going to pardon them and say, okay, bygones are bygones. And now let's get back to making South Carolina and Georgia work. No one wants to venture an opinion on this, how you might come down on the...
I'm gonna say forgiving,
You're so
unless
Jacob.
they do something like drastic.
Okay, Jacob would be forgiving. Ainsley, it looked like you were going to say something.
I mean, I think there's probably a lot of animosity between them. Like, been fighting for a couple of years, so.
Yeah, there is a lot of animosity between, and a lot of this, by the way, is rooted before the war breaks out. A lot of the grievances people had against each other, they'd had for a long time. And, you know, the war and what side you take exacerbates this, doesn't necessarily create it. You know, we always knew that guy was a jerk. And look, he turned out to be super patriot or super loyalist, depending on what your side is. And so, yeah, I'm glad at least one person wants to be forgiving. Yeah, and Marina says she probably wouldn't be that forgiving either. So it's good to think about where we would stand on this, because objectively we can see the best way to resolve this is for everybody just to get along. But that's not, and it's an easier thing to say than to do. It's a much easier thing to do if you're 200 years removed from it and you don't know what malevolent people these were to begin with. You know, I'm just giving you a bare outline of this, but if you really knew what some of these people were like. So now the Carolinians, and remember, if you are one of these folks who has been loyal, when these patriots were in control, they really made life miserable for you. And what happens in the wake of this is that there's no longer a Continental Army around in South Carolina. And so no one there to protect the patriots. On the other hand, there are some of the former patriot fighters who had been pardoned now are forced, okay, you have to swear allegiance to the British Crown, but that's not an easy thing to do. And what happens just to the loyalists form militia groups to protect other loyalists. And they start attacking the homes of patriots and burning them and doing other things. This is really revenge at work in South Carolina. And the Clinton, as I said, had gone back to New York. He left Lord Cornwallis in charge of a string of forts running roughly from Augusta, Georgia to the Carolina coast. And Cornwallis has a couple of really good officers under him. One is Bannister Tarleton. And Tarleton really comes to despise the Americans for a variety of reasons. It doesn't help that he has a few of his fingers shot off in one of these battles. And he has a legion called the Black Legion, which is there really to terrorize the former patriot population. And Patrick Ferguson is an American. He raises a regiment of loyalists who are both kind of patrolling this countryside between Augusta, Georgia, and Georgetown in Carolina. Now, what happens with the loyalists now attacking patriot settlements as a kind of revenge is, well, it's not going to shock anyone here to hear that the patriots start doing the same thing. In fact, some of the patriot leaders who had been paroled and then said, okay, you now have to swear allegiance. And they say, well, isn't that really violating the terms of my parole, which is not to take any sides? They do actually violate their parole and start, commanding guerrilla forces. One is Thomas Sumter, who is a former Continental Army officer from South Carolina. And Sumter had been paroled and he's living on his plantation. He said, okay, we'll just go back to the way things were. I'm not going to take any part in politics. So here I am just doing what I was doing before. And then a group of Tarleton's forces, a group of loyalists under Tarleton who had a longstanding grudge against Sumter, go in and burn down Sumter's house. well, that's really uncalled for. And so Sumter organizes his neighbors into a guerrilla force that goes and attacks some of these loyalist forces. And there's there's really interesting characters in South Carolina. Andrew Pickens is another. Pickens was a Presbyterian. I don't know if that means much to you. It meant something a great deal to him. He was actually an elder in the Presbyterian church. And the deans told me to stop asking people's religious affiliations. So I'm not going to ask, is anyone here a Presbyterian? And then start explaining the doctrine to us. No, but Pickens, Presbyterian elder, which implies he's a fairly respectable guy. And he had taken a loyalty oath after Charleston fell. And then a band of loyalists go and attack his farm. They knew this guy had been a loyalist for a long time. A patriot for a long time. So they go and attack Andrew Pickens's farm. And so he then raises his own group of patriots to go and attack these loyalists. You see, what's going to happen here is actually civil war breaking out in South Carolina, with former neighbors attacking others, and it's the grievances that predated the war. One of the most interesting is Francis Marion, and he had been captured actually when Charleston fell, and he organizes his own group who they hide out in swamps, hence he gets the nickname the Swamp Fox. And one of the regular American officers described Marion's crew as distinguished by small leather caps and the wretchedness of their attire. Remember, for most of the war, the Continental Army really didn't have much in the way of uniforms. So someone in the Continental Army is commenting on Francis Marion's wretched attire. It really says something about them. So their numbers did not exceed 20 men or boys, some white, some black, all mounted, but most of them miserably equipped. So here's about 20 guys, white and black, who were, they're on horses, which gives them a great advantage. It gives them a great deal of mobility. And this guy says their appearance was so burlesque that it was with much difficulty that the diversion of the regular soldiers was restrained by the officers. So Marion and his guys ride into a Continental Army camp as the Continental Army is being restored in South Carolina after the fall of Charleston. And the other patriots are laughing at him because they look so ridiculous. But what Marion is doing, along with Pickens and with Sumter, is striking at making it difficult for the British to hold on to this territory. As I said, they have this string of forts that they're trying to protect between Georgetown on the coast of South Carolina and Augusta in Georgia. And these irregular forces are attacking them, attacking British scouting parties, attacking British foraging parties. And wherever the British lines are weak, you're going to have these guys attack. And also, according to Lord Cornwallis, Marion had so wrought on the minds of the people by the terror of his threats and the cruelty of his punishments, and partly by the promise of plunder, that there was scarcely an inhabitant between the Santee and the Pedee rivers that was not in arms against us. So from Cornwallis's point of view, the people in this territory are becoming supportive of Marion and Pickens and Sumter, not because they agreed with them, but because, or they thought that the loyalists did worse, these guys are protecting us, but because Marion and these guys are actually threatening them. If you don't support us, we're going to burn down your house and we're going to kill you. We're going to do all kinds of outrageous things. I should say, there are atrocities being done on both sides. And this is something that happens in war. And you do have to take reports of atrocities with some grain of salt, depending on what the source is. But we do know about the real savagery of the war going on in South Carolina, as well as other things. The painting behind me is of an episode. By the way, this painting is in the Museum of Fine Arts. I don't think it's on display. And it purports to be an engagement. Let's see, I may actually have one I can show you so you don't have to look around my head to see this. Okay, so it purports to be a British officer here who had come to talk to Marion here about exchanging prisoners. And this guy had ridden a long time to meet Marion, and you can see Marion is hiding out in the swamps. This painting is from about 1818 or 1819. And as the British officer already had a long day, when it's time for him to go home, Marion says, well, why don't you join us for dinner? And here you can see the dinner being prepared. It's basically roasted turnips. And this British officer is just stunned because here are these guys, and you've already had this description of they're wearing rags basically, and they're eating these turnips. They're not getting paid anything. And the British officer's comment when he reports on this is, we will never be able to beat these people because here these guys are living in the swamp eating turnips, but they're fighting against us. You can see the British officer's wearing a nice uniform. And so this is this warfare going on in the backcountry of South Carolina becomes much more brutal as the war goes on. Now, meanwhile, the fact that Benjamin Lincoln has surrendered his army in Charleston, the Americans have surrendered Savannah, doesn't mean that the Americans know they cannot give up on the Carolinas and on Georgia. And so Congress really wants to do something here as a way of shoring up the war in the South. And so what Congress does after and by the way, Marion, Pickens, Sumter are very effective attacking the British where they are weak. And Cornwallis is going to keep sending out patrols to try to subdue the frontier. And at the same time, the Cherokee Indians had been fighting with the British against the Americans, and that is enough to keep the area in turmoil. But Cornwallis is reluctant to send out a major force to basically fight these different small groups of rabble partisans he can't really find. Now, Congress decides it needs to do something to make sure that the Americans can hold on to the Carolinas. So in 1779, the Congress sends Horatio Gates south to take command of the Continental Army. Remember, Gates had strong support in Congress from a lot of folks who thought he should be the commanding general rather than Washington. And what better opportunity to show this than now, when Gates can go down, take command of this Continental Army, and maybe enlist this rabble into the cause and expel the British from the Carolinas. So Gates goes down to find the remnants of the Continental Army, which is in Camden, which is in the interior of South Carolina. It's near the border of South Carolina and North Carolina. Here, let me see if I can draw another map. I apologize for not thinking of this before. Let's see. Okay, so. Okay, so here is the coast. Charleston is here. And there are these kind of slow winding rivers that feed through the low country of South Carolina, which is where the rice plantations are. You get into the interior, the ground is a little higher, and it's less, the backcountry had been becoming more settled in the middle of the century with people coming down from Pennsylvania. I mean, a lot of German immigrants, Scottish immigrants, and so on, moving into the interior, which is where Pickens and Marion and Sumter were. And Gates comes down and he finds the remnants of the Continental Army at the town of Camden in the interior and thinks, okay, this would be a good base for us to use. And he is going to get in touch with the various partisan leaders, Sumter, Marion, and Pickens. And, so Gates he takes command and is trying to shore things up. But of course, Gates doesn't know that it's come to Cornwallis's attention that Gates has arrived and is trying to reestablish the Continental Army at Camden. And actually, Cornwallis has pretty good intelligence, and he attacks Gates Gates has about 4,000 regulars. And what Gates is going to do is go and attack Cornwallis. He thinks he'll launch a surprise attack. And it's impossible to do a surprise attack when the other side finds out you're launching a surprise attack. And unfortunately for Gates, he doesn't realize the surprise is over. And so it's just an attack that goes disastrously for Gates and for his, he actually has a larger force. Cornwallis only has about a couple of thousand regulars. Gates has about 4,000, but the fact that it's not a surprise means Cornwallis is able to rout Gates completely. And Gates, I think he does set a record for getting 160 miles in under a day. By the next day, he's 160 miles away in Hillsborough, North Carolina. That is, he's gotten away from the battlefield even more quickly than is humanly possible. So this, by the way, Gates's ignominious flight from Camden is pretty much the end of Gates's military career, or the idea that he should be the new Washington and take command of everything. It's a disaster, of course, for the United States, for the Continental Army, to have Gates's forces so handily defeated here. But in the long run, it's actually not a bad thing. Finally, we're not going to hear that Gates is the genius who should be given full command of everything. I'm sorry if I'm sounding like I didn't like Horatio Gates that much, and I'm glad he's out of the way. I have no personal grudge against Horatio Gates, nor should you. Okay. Okay. So, so what happens in the wake of this is, Congress does want someone to go and hold on to the southern states. And the person that Washington is going to send next is Nathaniel Greene. Greene had been the quartermaster, Greene from Rhode Island. And if you go to these southern states, aside from the three partisans I mentioned, Pickens, Sumter, and Marion, Nathaniel Greene from Rhode Island is the greatest military hero in the Revolution in South Carolina and Georgia. It's why there are so many places named for Greene in these areas. And in fact, after the war, Georgia gives him a plantation. That's a story for another day. So Greene is sent to take command of things in the wake of this disaster. We'll get to that in a bit, because there are a couple of other things happening simultaneously. This is one of the real well, as you probably know from your own lives, there are always lots of things happening simultaneously, and kind of sorting out what precedes what sometimes is a challenge. Everything influences everything else. But here's the big news for us, aside from this disaster in the South, and that is definitely bad news. Lafayette had gone to France in 1778 and early 1779, and Lafayette had done what no one else could have done. Remember, the French had agreed to support the Americans in the war, and the French were going to do this by sending an army that would cooperate with Washington. And of course, the French have their own agenda. I'm not fault, every country has its own agenda. And the real goal for France was to kind of hurt the British and support their forces in the West Indies. So you have Comte d'Estaing coming with his forces and the unfortunate Chevalier Saint-Sauveur. And you will think after the Chevalier Saint-Sauveur gets killed in Boston, it's a cinch the king's not going to send many more forces over to America. So you can see Lafayette really has his work cut out for him in trying to get the king to send more support to the Americans. But what Lafayette does is even more extraordinary. He persuades the king that you can't just send an army to cooperate. Washington, Lafayette tells the king, is the greatest military leader of all time. And you need to send a general who will serve under Washington, a general and a French army to serve under Washington. I don't think it seems to me impossible that anyone could convince the king that this is a good idea. That's one step. Convince the king, yeah, we should send a general in an army that is going to be at the command of this American. None of us have even met him except for Lafayette. And, remember the unfortunate General du Coudray and falling off the horse, and, that we've sent other generals and it hasn't ended well. But now we're going to get a general to go there and serve under Washington. And then the next step is this, getting a general to agree to go. Where are you going to find a French general who wants to do this? Lafayette's able to do both. He convinces the king, if you really want to win the war, what you need to do is send a general in an army to serve under Washington. And then secondly, what you need to do is find a general to do this. And the general that agrees to go is the Comte de Rochambeau. I think they had to go through a number of generals. And so Rochambeau is going to be sent to America. And he arrives in Newport in the late summer of 1780. And Washington then goes from his headquarters in New Jersey into Wethersfield, Connecticut, where Washington and Rochambeau meet. So you have a meeting between the French general coming to serve under Washington and Washington himself to figure out what is our overall strategy. And these two guys are a little wary of each other. I mean, Washington's not saying, he's happy to have French support, but how much French support is going to turn into France running the show? And Rochambeau, of course, he is a real general, unlike Washington, although Rochambeau has heard from Lafayette that Washington is the guy. And so Rochambeau had arrived with about 5,000 men in Newport. The British, by the way, had withdrawn from Newport at this point. And then they meet in Wethersfield to plan their joint operations against the British. And their joint operations, what would that include? It could be they're going to try to take New York. Again, Rochambeau is going to have a French fleet coming, and that might be a worthwhile thing. Or it could be, who knows? I mean, Rochambeau is at Washington's disposal here. And, so Washington had gone to meet with Rochambeau. And along the way, of course, in September, he had stopped at Westchester, New York, to confer with Benedict Arnold. And Arnold had been the real hero of Saratoga, had been wounded at Saratoga, had fought valiantly in Canada. He is one of the great forces on Washington's side. And Washington, after the British left Philadelphia, had prevailed upon Congress to have Arnold put in charge of Philadelphia. And Washington did run Philadelphia after the British evacuation. And in doing that, Arnold was a brilliant general and had really some very terrific ideas about things. And he, like Washington, always felt that Congress is inept and Congress is really botching this whole thing. And you have a lot of mediocrity among the officers. By the way, in any kind of human endeavor, you're going to have a lot of mediocrity. So I'm not saying that is a bad thing, but here you have someone who is brilliant like Arnold, and it chafes him that he is surrounded by mediocrity. As I said, Washington might also have felt this. He certainly bridled at Congress, and he certainly recognized the human frailty of those around him. But Washington was wise enough not to let on about this and not to let it. By the way, this is one of the many reasons why Washington's character is worth studying and emulating. You will go far if you emulate Washington in all of these regards. So look at this as a moral lesson I'm giving to you, as opposed to just a recitation of facts. So anyway, Washington knew we need to do something for Arnold, so puts him in charge in Philadelphia. And then what do you know? Arnold makes enemies in Philadelphia. And he makes enemies. He also makes one wonderful friend. He marries a young woman from one of the wealthiest families in Philadelphia. Her family, unfortunately, were loyalists. And here is Arnold. He had been a merchant in Connecticut before the war, and now he is living, basically not being paid anything to be a general in the army, running things in Philadelphia. And his wife, young Miss Shippen, she doesn't have extravagant tastes. That's kind of something we've made up, because what happens next is one of those extraordinary stories that I'm afraid I'm going to have to tell you now about why Benedict Arnold is known as this great trader, when I've just been telling you he's this great military genius and so on. Two things. Peggy Shippen, his wife, young Leah, she's not a bad person. And it's unclear whether or not she was forcing her husband to live more extravagantly than he should have. But who doesn't like nice things? Okay, we'll say that. And secondly, he is a military officer suddenly running this city, and he does things that irk people. You know, the mayor does things that irk us. We can vote against him. Arnold, the general, does things that irk us. Well, what can we do? One thing Arnold did was, there were some loyalists who wanted to get their things out of town. So Arnold let them use some wagons that the military had to get their stuff out of town. People who also were trying to get their stuff out of town say, hey, wait a minute, he's showing favoritism to them. And isn't he letting private people use public property? And isn't that a bad thing to do? Arnold actually gets court-martialed for this, for the misuse of public property. You know, it sounds innocuous enough. You let someone borrow a military wagon. It would be like, say President Kelly lets James borrow Suffolk's bus, and people say, wait a minute, why is he borrowing the Suffolk University bus? It's a minibus, actually, and I don't know what you were doing with it, but now I have everyone else in the class saying, hey, how come we didn't get to drive the bus when James did? And this is what happens with Arnold. It's a misuse of public property. He's court-martialed. And as there are folks in Congress who really want to get rid of Washington, there are also a lot who don't really like Benedict Arnold. And so there's a move in Congress to get him cashiered, and Washington protects him. And the court-martial stops short of calling for him to be dismissed. Instead, it wants him to be reprimanded. And Washington has to write a letter of reprimand to Benedict Arnold. And I think you or I would love to get a letter of reprimand like this. It's the most gentle reprimand I think ever written. But Arnold really feels a snub here. You know, who do these people think they are? They're inept. It's a disaster that Congress is managing this war, and now they're reprimanding me. Now, it's this that comes to the attention of the British command that recognizes that in Arnold, they might have an American officer who might be willing for a certain price to come over to the other side. And remember, the British had occupied Philadelphia. And in fact, Peggy Shippen, the young lady whom Benedict Arnold marries, had also known Major John Andre, a British officer. She knew other British officers. She was part of the Mejianza for the Hows and leaving Philadelphia. And somehow, well, Major Andre, who is now based in New York, goes up to Westchester and to West Point. You know, after Arnold is cashiered from Philadelphia, Washington puts him in charge of West Point, a vital link in this connection between New England and the rest of the country. And Arnold is now in charge at West Point, and he has a visit from Major Andre, who had established communication with Arnold. And the plan that they come up with is actually the British will come up the river, attack West Point. Arnold will pretend to fight them off, but the fort can't be defended and the British will take it. And then Arnold will be brought as a prisoner to New York, but actually he will then become an officer in the British Army. And the thinking is, Arnold is such a dynamic, popular officer, a hero to many of his men, as well as other officers who also feel that Congress has botched things. They will come over to our side. It's really a big plan to have Arnold be the first of the American officers who recognizes the cause is lost. And our only real choice is now to turn to the other side and fight against the bad elements on our side, of which Arnold knows there are some. Arnold apparently was also somewhat aggrieved that now the French are involved in this. Remember, Arnold is a New Englander, and the New Englanders had spent 150 years fighting against the French. And New England Protestants really were unhappy with now having His Most Christian Majesty, King Louis XVI, as an ally here, when what we thought we were doing was fighting for New England's God. And now we have the French coming in. That's at least part of the thinking here. So anyway, Washington on his trip up to see Rochambeau calls on Arnold. Everything is fine there. And then he goes off, meets with Rochambeau. And then on his return, he sends a rider ahead. It's early in the morning. And Washington usually liked to accomplish a lot of things before breakfast. And another moral lesson from Washington. He would be up for several hours before he would have breakfast. So he leaves Wethersfield, heads for West Point, sends a rider ahead to tell Arnold, we'll be coming for breakfast. And Washington and his men finally arrive at West Point at the headquarters of Benedict Arnold, and Arnold is not there. And Washington is someone who thinks a lot about, social obligations. Your commanding general is coming for breakfast. You at least should be there. And Mrs. Arnold is upstairs. She's not to be seen. Okay. So where is Arnold? And Washington is a little annoyed. And then they do have breakfast. Arnold had the foresight to have breakfast prepared for General Washington. And Washington thinks, well, maybe he's gone over to West Point to see to the fortifications. And so Washington and his party then cross the Hudson River to West Point, and they inspect the fortifications, but there's no sign of Arnold. And what's even worse, the fortifications are in terrible shape. The guns are placed in crazy positions. And it looks like someone has gone out of his way to make the fort indefensible. And all of this, as you can see, is going to get Washington more and more angry with Arnold. For A, he didn't show up to welcome me. And then B, I thought he was a good general, but he leaves West Point in this kind of condition. And there's really no sign of him. And then Washington and his party recross the river, go back to Arnold's house. And while they're there, someone from the local militia shows up with three guys who had, these three guys, by the way, Westchester County, which is south of West Point, and it's this borderland between New York, which the British hold, and West Point, which the Americans hold. And as in South Carolina, there had been a civil war going on in this area. The northern part of the county tends to be more patriot. The southern part of the county is more loyalist. And the two groups call themselves cowboys and skinners. So if you were a cowboy, you're on one side. If you're a skinner, you're on the other. And it was a very dangerous place to traverse. And these three guys had formed they were patrolling. And a man comes along riding a horse. And the first thing this guy notices is one of these guys is wearing a green coat, which is like part of a British uniform. So he thinks they probably are a British party. And so they ask him, are you from the upper part or the lower part? Well, he says, I'm from the lower part. And they ask him to get off his horse. And then they search him. And he begins to think, maybe they're just robbing me. But then they ask him to take off his boots, and he thinks maybe they want to rob his boots. And inside his boots, they find all of these papers. The papers include maps and things. only one of these three guys knows how to read. And he is able to make out that some of these documents actually are signed by Benedict Arnold, whom he knows as the commander at West Point. And so he says, well, we should send you to see General Arnold. And then actually first he brings him to the local militia officer who can read, reads the documents. And he thinks I should send all of this to Arnold because, of course, Arnold is the guy in charge in this area. And then he thinks better of it because Arnold seems to be communicating with this guy whose name is, he tells him, is John Anderson, about West Point. And through Anderson, he seems to be communicating with General Clinton in New York. Now, there's been another interesting thing happening over the previous day. This guy, Anderson, had come up on a boat, and the boat had been sitting in the Hudson River. And okay, I'll tell you what was happening while the boat was sitting on the Hudson River. Anderson, who actually is Major John Andre, had gone ashore to the home of a loyalist, a guy named Beverly Robinson, and there he had met with Benedict Arnold. And while he and Arnold were meeting, some of the officers at West Point see this suspicious looking boat sitting on the Hudson River, so they start firing at it. And the captain of this suspicious looking boat on the Hudson River has to drop down a little bit. And our friend Anderson Andre realizes he can't get back to the boat. And so Arnold gives him a pass so that he can go to New York, go back through the American lines to New York. And this boat is part of the plan to take West Point. So all of these things are in the documents that these guys find in Andre's boot. And they send them first to their commander, who then sends them to the headquarters of Arnold, which is where Washington is. And Washington and his men are having dinner at the Arnold house. And the messenger comes in with all of these documents. And Washington opens them up. And Washington immediately sees what's happened. Arnold had been negotiating with the British to sell West Point. That's why the fort was in disarray. It wasn't because Arnold was inept. It was because Arnold was a traitor. And Washington immediately has to find out who else was involved in this. It seems impossible that there's an officer of Arnold's character and caliber who is going to become a traitor and that there aren't others involved. And if you can't trust Benedict Arnold, who can you trust? I know that sounds like a crazy question to ask, but it's the reason why Benedict Arnold's treason becomes such an important thing. Who else is involved in this? Now, Arnold, realizing when the ship's getting fired on and that Washington is coming, and now he gets a message saying, hey, we found this guy on the road carrying all these documents. Arnold realizes the game is up. He gets into a boat, gets onto that ship that takes him down to New York, leaving John Andre now in the hands of the Continental Army and Arnold now ensconced in New York. He sends a message to his wife. Actually, it arrives when Washington is still there. What would you do with poor Peggy Arnold? By the way, she's upstairs recently having given birth, and she's now gets this letter from her husband saying, oh, by the way, I've decided to change sides here. And so I'm in New York. I hope you'll be able to come to New York too. Imagine how she feels. And she's hysterical, I should say. And Washington does allow her to go to New York because Washington is, after all, a gentleman on top of everything else. But here, big problem, what to do about Benedict Arnold? Are there any other officers who are part of this whole plot? And what to do about Major Andre? Major Andre found behind your lines, dressed in civilian clothes. Thus, he is not a combatant, he's a spy. And Washington convenes a court-martial for Andre, which he really wants to find out who else was involved in this. And the court-martial concludes, well, no other officers go to join the British in the wake of this, which of course is bad news for the British. And Major Andre who had come up to formalize plans, now is held, and he's tried by a court-martial. And the court-martial concludes that he's behind our lines, wearing civilian clothes, therefore he's a spy. And so spies are hanged rather than shot. This is why Nathan Hale was hanged in New York. And Washington is corresponding with General Clinton about this, because what Washington really wants is for Clinton to send Arnold back. And the one bargaining chip Washington has with Clinton is, of course, Major Andre. Everybody, by the way, loved Major Andre. Even now, he's being held by the Americans, and he's tried by these American officers, and they all love Major Andre because he's such a wonderful guy. And he's young, he's handsome, he's everything you would want a real officer to be. And here he's caught up with Benedict Arnold, and he's tried as a spy and sentenced to be hanged. And Washington wants General Clinton to send him Arnold, and he'll send Andre. But Clinton knows if the British hope to get other American officers to switch sides, and the first one who does is sent back and hanged, that's really going to hurt their recruiting among American officers. So Clinton cannot send Arnold back, and Washington can't send Andre back. And so sadly, what happens is that Andre has to be hanged. And Andre had asked, knowing that it was a death sentence he did hope that maybe the other officers would feel merciful enough to allow him to be shot by a firing squad rather than hanged. And when he is escorted out of the place where he is held and he sees a gallows set up rather than a firing squad, he winces, but then says, "'Tis but a momentary pang." You can see it's this kind of character that makes everyone love Andre. He is a guy with great courage as well as dignity. And so Andre is hanged, sadly. Nathaniel Greene presided over Andre's court-martial. He felt really conflicted about having to hang him, but this is what you have to do. Arnold, meanwhile, is in New York, and he does write a long apologia about why he has changed sides, and the French figure largely in this, that suddenly we're having the Catholic menace involved here, and things would have been much better had we kept France out of it. Now he can't get along with this, and he wants other Americans to join him, which I have to tell you, Americans will not do. And the Americans realize that with this, they have avoided a catastrophe. If there were more officers like Arnold, or if Arnold and the British had been able to pull off the capture of West Point, that would have been as bad as the loss of Charleston and Savannah for the Americans. And Nathaniel Greene wrote to his wife that the discovery of Arnold's betrayal seems to have been providential. And it convinces me, Greene said, that the liberties of America are an object of divine protection. Well, quite possibly they were. Now, Greene, after overseeing the hanging of Major Andre, does go down to the Carolinas to try to shore up the American effort there to take command of the army that Horatio Gates had led to stunning defeat. And so this is the state of things by the end of 1780. We've had this major betrayal by Benedict Arnold at West Point. However, the Continental Army recovers from it. You also have had the fall of Charleston and Savannah, and the war bogging down into a civil war in South Carolina, Georgia, and North Carolina. And really unclear at this point how either side is going to win this, even with the arrival of a French army commanded by Rochambeau. I think I should probably let you go. I'm just warming up, as you can probably tell. So I may just sit here for the rest of the night telling myself these stories, but I think your reward for your patience, unless someone is thinking about a way to betray the class, I hope not. Are there any questions?
I'm sort of wondering why Andre went on shore and sort of endangered himself. Like,
What's
seems
the
to be
fear?
really
It's here he's meeting with Benedict Arnold, and he could, it would be relatively easy if the boat remained, the Vulture was the name of the vessel, if it remains where it is, to get aboard it. And he's several miles south of West Point. He's not actually meeting at the same house where Arnold is. Arnold had come down to meet with him. And so it is somewhat dangerous. But then he has to go back by land. And that is really where he runs into trouble, because he's apprehended by this scouting party. Initially, he thinks they're a scouting party from our side, but he can't really say, hey, which side are you on? Because he's trying to deduce. So it's a dangerous thing to engage in something like this, as you should know. And, it's safer for him. I mean, Arnold could not have gone aboard the Vulture because that's a British warship. And Andre had been they call someone like this a handler, who's in the British Army. He's dealing with this guy. He's the handler of him. And he had certainly knew Mrs. Arnold, and he's, it's a dangerous assignment. But again, if you are an officer, doing dangerous things is part of your duty. Good question, though. Anyone else have questions, comments? Well, okay. Well, I will see you all on Wednesday, and we'll find out how all of this works out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
So long, Professor.
Good to see you. Take care.